All right, here we go with section 7, and here's the focus question. The 1960s climaxed in 1968 when profound events happened so quickly that society seemed to be disintegrating. In January 1968, the Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive, multiple uprisings throughout South Vietnam that took major cities and completely surprised U.S. military leaders. U.S. forces repelled the attacks and inflicted heavy losses, but the intense fighting, captured on television, eroded the confidence of the public in political and military leaders who repeatedly claimed that victory was not far off. Leading figures in politics and the press now criticized the war. Eugene McCarthy, an anti-war senator from Minnesota, announced he would seek the Democratic presidential nomination, and with the support of thousands of students, won the New Hampshire primary. Lyndon Johnson, stunned, refused to send 200,000 more troops to Vietnam as the Army suggested, and declared he would not seek re-election. Peace talks began in Paris. At the time, Martin Luther King Jr. was organizing a Poor People's March on Washington to demand more federal anti-poverty programs. But after traveling to Memphis to support a strike by black sanitation workers there, King was murdered by a white assassin. The greatest outbreak of urban violence in American history soon erupted. Washington, D.C. was occupied by soldiers before order was restored. At the end of April, students protesting Columbia University's participation in defense research and its plan to build a gymnasium in a public park occupied by build a gymnasium in public park occupied campus buildings and were forcibly removed by police. In June, a young Palestinian nationalist assassinated Robert F. Kennedy, who was seeking the Democratic nomination as an anti-war candidate. In August, tens of thousands of anti-war demonstrators went to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago to protest the nomination of Vice President Hubert Humphrey, and Chicago's police wildly attacked the demonstrators. The government indicted 8 radicals for conspiring to incite the violence, and after a tumultuous trial of the Chicago Eight, several were found guilty. Their charges were overturned on appeal, given the flagrant bias of the judge. The year 1968 was one of worldwide turmoil. In many nations, young radicals confronted power structures, borrowing language and strategies from America's protest movements and adapting them to their own circumstances. Television carried images of protests to other countries simultaneously. Massive anti-war protests happened in London, Rome, Paris, Munich, and Tokyo with great violence. In Italy, students occupied universities. In Paris, a nationwide student uprising that began in May of 1968 echoed American students' demands, but in France, millions of French workers joined the protests by going on strike, demanding higher wages and workplace democracy. A general strike resulted that nearly toppled the government. In communist Czechoslovakia, reformist leaders trying to democratize socialism were ousted by a Soviet invasion. Troops fired on students demonstrating for greater democracy at the Olympics in Mexico City, killing more than 500. In Northern Ireland, still part of Great Britain after Ireland achieved independence, the police attacked a nonviolent march demanding an end to religious discrimination, initiating an era of violence called the Troubles. Throughout the world, American second-wave feminism inspired women of other nations to protest for equal rights and citizenship. Women in Catholic nations such as France and Italy won the right to obtain divorce and have abortions. Our Bodies Ourselves, a book published by Boston women dealing with widely misunderstood women's health issues such as pregnancy and childbirth, menopause, and birth control, was translated into 20 languages. Though 1968 was a year of radical protest, the year marked a conservative reaction as well. Social protests sparked calls for law and order. Black militancy provoked white backlash, a growing force in politics. The Supreme Court's invention and protection of rights led to claims that distant federal bureaucrats were meddling with local tradition. In August, Richard Nixon made a striking political comeback by winning the Republican presidential nomination. He campaigned as champion of the silent majority, ordinary Americans who believed that change had gone too far, and he called for law and order. Facing a divided Democratic Party, Nixon barely won a victory over Hubert Humphrey. Yet George Wallace, running as an independent on a platform of resentment against civil rights, the Great Society, and the Warren Court, received 13% of the national vote. The Nixon and Wallace totals taken together showed that liberalism was in retreat. But 1968 did not mark the end of the 60s. The Great Society actually peaked under Nixon, and second-wave feminism surged in the 1970s. but Nixon's election initiated a period of conservatism in American politics. The 1960s did not produce a revolution, but it did revolutionize American life. It produced new rights and understandings of freedom. It allowed racial minorities to enter mainstream American life, although it did not solve urban poverty. It started to transform women's status. It made Americans expect new things from government, like clean air and old age medical insurance. But it also undermined public confidence in political leaders. Relations between the generations and between whites and non whites, along with every institution in society, changed. The debates of the 1960s would live on in later questions and controversies, and as the nation became more conservative, the 1960s became blamed for many social ills. However, the U.S. became more open, more tolerant, and more free in this decade. So that'll do it for Section 7. We'll be back with the next chapter next time.